Okay, cool. So, hello, recording. We're just gonna start. So yeah, maybe I've got some slides which I'll show in a sec. And Michelle, I'm gonna put you on the spot because you came in first. Basically, when I share my slides, my computer is quite old, so then all I can see is my slides and not the faces. So if anyone's like put a message in the group chat or put the hand up or something while I go through the slides, there's only a few. Maybe you could just like jump in and interrupt me if that's okay with you. Sounds good. Okay. So maybe if we all go around and introduce ourselves for a second. Yeah, maybe Michelle, if you want to go first.
Hi, my name is Michelle. I'm a PhD student at the Astrophysics department at Exeter. So that's how I came to know the workshop. How got my email. And yeah, I'm not sure what else to say. Yeah.
That's all good. Have you done any kind of eco things in the past, or is this kind of new?
I guess this is my first sort of structured thing, but I do a lot of reading around the subject. My master's was in pollution over East Asia, so I have some kind of scientific background in it. Mm-hmm. I also recently just finished a course in humanitarian action, so sort of and kind of kept everything the work that I did for that. My coursework was all from the slant of climate change. So yeah.
That's cool. That's cool. Megan, if you want to go next.
Yeah, hi everyone, I'm Megan. Just finished my first year of geography, so I think most of us are geographers here, which is good. And yeah, really grateful to be here. Joined Extinction Rebellion in Exeter in May. That's been quite cool. Recently done some volunteering with the Eco Warriors, that basically go to different festivals, encouraging people to take home their tents, recycle, yeah, that's about it.
Martha?
Hi, I'm Martha. I'm also just finished first year geography student. I used to be in some local groups before uni, and then I'm just kind of looking to get more involved and learning a lot more, especially now in Exeter. Yep.
Cool. Kimberly?
Hi, I'm Kimberly. I'm also just first year. Well, I've just finished my first year of university studying geography as well, and I'm really excited just to, get to know other people and talk about the issue of climate justice.
Cool. And Al Huggy, if I'm pronouncing that right. If you're free to talk. No. Okay, that's fine. So I'm going to do the slides now. Let me share my screen. Okay, so Michelle, you're just going to have to interrupt me if someone comes in or anything. So, yeah. Oh, is that all good?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, cool. So yeah, here we go. Climate Justice Conversations number 2. It's the 11th, and James Dyke will be here soon. Obviously, this will work better when I can actually see you, but these are the reminders of the kind of hand signals that are going on. This is my first time using them online, so obviously I'm still a beginner about that, so don't worry if you put up the wrong one or in the moment it doesn't happen, but we can just try. We've got 8 weeks, so it'll be fine. Yeah, so this is me. Basically, I did geography and sustainability at Exeter because I did a classic gap year and went to Galapagos, and I mean, it is classed as voluntourism now, so not the best way out there to do eco stuff, but still pretty cool at the time. And then I was like, I want to do some eco stuff. So now that I've just done my 3rd year, I ended up president of Be the Change with Becky, and that's kind of how I know Emma. And I went to COP last year in Glasgow, partly because the uni was pretty bad at involving students. They were good, but Be the Change is the biggest eco group on campus, and they never talked to us about it. So I managed to get funding from the uni, which was super cool to go up. But other than that, yeah. So we went to COP, came back, started talking to students, and they were like, "Oh, uni's not doing that much." So I basically founded and helped launch the 5 Demands, which is that like black and white poster there. And amazingly, we've actually achieved number 1, which is net zero by 2030. So the uni's like announced that they're going to try and be net zero emissions by then. But yeah, I'm just like going to try and educate a few more people on how I've kind of promoted the 5 Demands so that they can do that next year when I'm not here. I'm pretty sure Martha's actually on this slide where it says Mikhail Karakis. So I've done a few workshops before on like well-being, which I'm actually doing for you guys next week. And then I did intersectional environmentalism as well, because of obviously like Exeter's very like white, you know, middle class, you know, is quite important obviously. And my own personal thing is ecogrief.exeter, which is like a well-being project. And hopefully now that I'm trying to do job stuff, I can actually make that a career and stuff. So yeah, but you can follow that if you want. It's like, I haven't posted in a while, but I'm going to start it back up. It's like well-being plus climate change and how that interacts with each other. Yeah. And then also in second year, I made like a huge database. I went through all the modules in Exeter, this whole database about like, you could like click on your subject and it would come up with what modules you could do relating to the climate crisis, but it's a bit outdated now. So yeah, I think that's it. I'm hoping to do a marine management masters down in Cornwall next year, probably not this year, next year, and I'll probably be in Exeter in September. But yeah, I've done just quite a lot of workshops and things like that now, so that's quite fun. So then we have those resources that we did, which I found really good. I don't know why I didn't think that Burnt wasn't going to be as good as it was, but I really enjoyed reading Burnt. I just thought I really like when they add a lot of case studies in as well with their writing, because I'm really interested in like world politics and all of that as well. So yeah, these were a couple, and then obviously there was the Yikes podcast as well, which I didn't even know Michaela did, but it was really good. So they were mostly, it's a bit like an introduction to climate justice. And it's okay if you haven't had the time to listen and read, but that's okay. Like, we can just talk about it. I thought it was really interesting. I'm pretty sure it was in the Yikes one, when they were talking about that you could make the world worse with the climate movement. Like, just because you're fighting for environmental causes doesn't mean they're morally and ethically good. Like, you still need all these other kind of contexts involved the whole time. So I thought that was interesting. One of my questions I'm always thinking about is the climate movement getting too like academic and theoretical? So it's like not accessible and applicable to the working class, or anyone really, you know, because obviously it should be for all, but sometimes all these words, they get quite complicated. And then Chris said this like last quote: the COVID-19 pandemic has shown what bosses are prepared to put their workers through during a crisis. And that just like, it was one of those like light bulb moments for me. Like, that's such a good way of looking at it. Like, we've seen already how bad it's getting and how bad it could get, and like that's just like COVID plus cost of living crisis, you know. Yeah, anyway, I thought that was interesting too. And then otherwise, my other thing I was going to say, which we can do in a bit, I'd quite like a bit of discussion and then we can go into this if we've got time, but it was a good way of describing intersectional environmentalism. So I'm going to come out of this. Stop sharing. Okay, nice. Hopefully there weren't any questions or anything that I missed. Okay, cool. So maybe we could start. I know it's kind of a weird way of saying which one's your favorite, because they're both really good, but it's kind of a good way to start a discussion, like thinking why you actually preferred one if you did. So for me, I prefer Burnt. Maybe it's just because I like reading more than a podcast, but just that quote I just said just kind of, it was like a light bulb moment, as I said. So is there anyone want to explain which one their favourite one is and why? Yeah, Megan, go for it.
I'll be honest. So I've read the Burn chapter 2 and chapter 1, and I listened briefly to the Dyke podcast, but I didn't really like tune in. So I think for me, my preference is the Burn book. I think, yeah, really interesting. Love the use of case studies to like support it, and the statistics were quite shocking, I found. I think, yeah, I found it very interesting, the fact that obviously the people that contribute the least to the climate crisis seem to be the worst affected and are. And it's very much, the climate crisis is very much a social issue. And yeah, I think that's been interesting for me, and yeah, keen to learn more, really.
Yeah. Sometimes I find it also, like anyone, just chime in whenever. Sometimes I find it hard that there's so much going on, and then you want to, it's kind of weird, like maybe it's a personal thing, but I want to be an environmentalist, and then I see maybe something else happening, like obviously like the dependency on food banks and stuff like that in the UK at the moment is like at an all-time high and stuff. And so then I'm, you know, my mind is like, okay, go to that, and then you're like, oh well, that's not an eco issue, I need to do eco, and it's like, it's not, because it's all connected. Especially one thing for me was the kind of the refugee plan to send refugees to Rwanda. To me, that's an immediate connection to the climate crisis, and that's only going to get worse. And it's like also sending them somewhere with, you know, I don't know, it was just crazy, but that was kind of like made a link as well. And I thought that's like a very much an eco issue, but then not a lot of people would see it like that. I don't know.
Yeah, I want to add, I think a lot of the coming issues, like that are like, there's a lot of issues on the horizon that I see being the case. Like refugees will only increase in number. We are not getting less refugees. And I think attitudes in the West need to be like shifted, or we need to get a handle on like misinformation and educating older generations, because if we're already at the point where we've got like racism so inherent and embedded into our policies and how we deal with refugees, that's just not, like, it's just, people have to go somewhere. People will go somewhere. It's not a question of if or when they arrive. It's a question of when and how we deal with it, whether that's in a humane matter or whether that's shipping them off to Rwanda for God knows what inhumane reason.
Yeah. And I think it's like, it would be so useful to the climate movement if it was advertised correctly to the public that stuff like the migrant issue is an eco issue, and therefore come along to the protests and come along to the rallies and like join together. Because I see a lot of eco people at other issue protests, but then I don't always see those other kind of groups come to the eco ones. I don't know, I think that's an issue for the future, kind of how like you tell the story of like connecting it as well, and for older people as well, like that be, do you know what I mean, like, you know, that's kind of a stereotypically older person thing, is these people, I just want my home to be how I remember it, blah blah blah. And if you could tell them that that was an eco thing, I don't know, different ways of looking at it. But yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, carry on.
So I didn't have time to read Burn, but I did listen to some of the podcasts I was doing stuff, and they mentioned at some point how like climate justice and intersectionality is like being talked about more, it seems, but there is also a risk of being a bit of a buzzword and becoming like more like trendy and kind of losing its value as like a word and its practice, which I thought was quite like interesting.
Yeah, I like these words because I've been at uni and I'm in that kind of academic environment, and I like learning about all these new things, but sometimes I'm like, it's like, how do you describe yourself? And then you want to use like 5 different words because you want to make sure that everyone knows you're also intersectional and also a feminist and all of this. I think it's interesting.
I'm sorry, I'm struggling with this mute button today. Yeah, no, I'm really curious about this. Like when you guys are saying about like too academic or like too wordy and things like that, because obviously I'm like coming from this as like I am a scientist, and so it's always really interesting to me to see what do people find like welcoming, like what do people find like conveys this information in a way that impacts you without also like draining people, because people also turn off after a while, right? If you hear too much about how bad the environment is, you will just like be like, I can't deal with this, it's too stressful, and then you just turn off. But like as a scientist, I find this really fascinating, like what the line is. How do I communicate to people in a way that like actually shows the depths to which science is telling us that we are in trouble?
Yeah, definitely. I don't know, it's like this distrust of science as well. But then I thought that had got better because of the COVID and everything like that. And that, you know, we'd have these like briefings from scientists every day on the news. I thought that would make it better, but I feel like ever since the pandemic, and like fair enough for the first bit, obviously, there's not been so much in the news about the climate crisis in my head as before the pandemic, but I don't know if people have seen that or not. Maybe you think differently.
Can we actually, this might be me being too much of a scientist, but can we actually go around, like what do you guys use for your news? So like when you wake up in the morning, when you go on Chrome, what do you look at? I'm like curious, because I go on pretty much exclusively The Guardian, and that is all I see, climate stuff. So I'm really curious what you guys read and how you consume information.
I do BBC News, like just almost exclusively. Especially, I mean, maybe it's bad, but I do. There's like well, not bad, but this might be why I do those top 10 things quite a lot. They have like 10 most popular, and so then there, all I see is like, I don't know. That's a mix as well. Yeah. How about the rest of you?
I think I look at a mix of BBC and The Guardian, but also like a lot of things like. It's kind of, but I do look at like Twitter a lot, and then if I see something where I'm like, that's interesting, whatever, then I like look more into it and more like reputable like resources. But like it is often like kind of the base point for things, like also just seeing other people's opinions about stuff. I do find quite helpful.
I've actually turned off quite a lot from social media in the last couple of months, which is kind of difficult because my eco grief stuff kind of has to be on social media as kind of the purpose of it. But I don't know, I just have got I don't know what it is about it, but I don't know, it's those like, I feel like I've seen too many now of those like infographic posts, like, and I just, for me sometimes I'm like obviously it's good to like share your opinions online, and sometimes I'm like, everyone's just saying the same thing over and over and over, and that's because I'm in this like one little echo chamber over here. I don't know. But yeah, I don't know if anyone's got like other thoughts about burnt, or what was the other one? Yikes? Is it? Yeah, yikes.
I really liked Burnt. Yeah, I liked it. I thought it was like a good intro chapter to these sorts of ideas. So my dad is quite a businessman. He's like the epitome of white businessman. And so I read it and I liked it, and then I looked back on it and I thought, oh, how would my dad, who is like kind of the stereotype of what the system is catered for and is about, think about that. And I think it is, it's interesting that we find it approachable, but he would probably find it too academic, and I would say that the people that actually need to be part of the change would probably find this too academic and too like airy fairy, like how did you like change the system, like and then you've got people like my dad who'd be like super practical and be like, okay, but what does that actually mean, like how do we employ people, how do we feed people, how do we so I think that's something that I like, that's probably not what the audience of this book is. That's not the purpose of this book. There's another book for that, but I would be interested in also seeing practical applications of what is being said in the book.
Yeah, I know what you mean. It's really hard because then you're like, oh, then someone should write a book about that, you know, catered for them. But then you're like, I don't know, sometimes I'm like, well, I don't know, that's not like radical. It's not got that like new perspective in, but then I don't know. It's hard. I don't know where I was going with that. If anyone's got a comment on it, go for it. Yeah, fair. Well, I just realised ecofascism is like a very academic kind of term. And what it means is putting the planet and nature before people, like full stop. So it's very much like, oh, we need to protect all of the giraffes, and therefore wherever giraffes are, we're gonna ban people from living and using that land because we need to protect the giraffe for like biodiversity and blah blah blah. And so obviously then you're just like not taking into account like people's livelihoods and rights and heritage of that land and things like that. So that's kind of what ecofascism means. And then because so in Yikes they talked about intersectional environmentalism being the same as like climate justice, and then one way that just like has stuck in my head is how Rennie Edo-Lodge, who wrote Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race, the way she described it was like intersectionality, an actual intersection, like crossroads, and like one way you've got like your gender coming from like the south, and then you got maybe your like race from the north, your age, like everything. And like your identity isn't like one or the other, it's however you stand in the middle of that, like everything's coming at you from different angles and all of these different things, and it's very difficult to isolate one of those factors of your identity and be like, that describes me, because you're like in the middle of that. And even if you've got someone with maybe the almost exactly the same identity like checklist, like you still would stand very differently, and like that's how you're going to see the world. So it's kind of like an issue, if you put like an issue in the middle of like those crossroads as well, it's just like how it comes together, like where on the map like do all those things that collide. So I thought that was like a really good way of describing it. But yeah, is there any other, like, what's the time? Oh, well, James Dyke should be coming in a minute, but is there any other kind of final thoughts you had about the podcast? Was there anything in it where you like learned something new or disagreed with? That's even more interesting. I like it when people disagree with something. If no one, well, one thing I like connected with in the Yikes podcast is it's like, it was kind of touched upon, I guess. So, and if people have got kind of reflections on this, or if you agree with it, like, let me know. It's, I'm finishing uni. Oh, James Dyke is here. Hi, James. Yeah, well, just my final thing was, you're finishing uni, you want to take action, you want to do, like, it's a doing thing. And yet you like come across all these climate justice issues. Well, obviously, like, I come from a very privileged place. And so then I'm like, I want to do something, and you feel like that's moving, it's like an action. But like often where I need to be is like, you think of listening as a very passive thing. And I think they were kind of talking about how one of their like New Year's resolutions changed. And I think that's quite interesting, that it's not always about changing like something externally. It's often about like just sitting as well. And I think that's still like just as worthy of your time and as your New Year's resolution as like moving and changing and all of that. But yeah, that was my last reflection. Hi, James.
Hello. How are you?
Yeah, good, thanks. I'm Beth, and I'm like the facilitator for today. Because Emma can't come. Mm-hmm. Yeah, we're really, really thankful to have you. Like, this is going to be great. And I think it's really good to have it at more of the beginning of the course as well, because this is our only second workshop. So
okay.
But yeah, I don't know. So most people here are scientists, and undergraduate or postgrad. I've just finished geography and sustainability undergraduate. Okay, that's kind of your audience. but yeah, if I don't know if you've got something prepared.
Well, I do. I've got numerous things prepared. So I give lots of talks about this. So I can give a talk at you. We could, and there's meant to be some time for Q&A, or we could have a general discussion, or we could have a general discussion and then I could talk to you about something, or we could, I don't know, because what I don't understand is where you all are with what it is that you want to know. So is there, because I got some notes from Emma about, you know, climate drivers and IPCC, and my assumption is that you might already know some of that. And therefore you might be interested in some other things, or so we can have a brief chat now to have a think about what it is that you want to get out of the session. So is there any like burning questions, anything you want to ask me, anything you want to talk about within the group or something? Is that okay?
Yeah, of course. I don't know if it's your well, you're definitely going to have like an interesting perspective on it, but I'm very interested in how we communicate the science, especially to people like not in academic spaces.
Okay.
And if you've got experiences, previous experiences with that would be great. Like, how do you adapt the science without making it ultimate? That would be great. Any from anyone else? Maybe you could give like a brief description of what you do at the moment, so people know exactly where you're coming from.
Yeah, sure. So I can certainly do some of the comms stuff, and then we can whiz through some, you know, where we are, where we're heading stuff thing. What I don't want to do is just make everyone depressed, because that seems to be what I do a lot. There is a really empowering and important message, and then something to discuss about. But often in these kind of events, I never really get there, because it's like, so James, tell us about climate change. And unfortunately, thus far, none of it's really very good. Right? There are messages of hope, and there are good things, and good things have absolutely happened. Right? It's not all doom and gloom, but some of the fundamentals are, you know, it is very worrying. So what I do is that I come from a sort of earth sciences background. So when I did my postdoc, I was actually on an astrobiology project. So we're interested in the long-term evolution of planets and life, and how does the emergence of life on a planet change it? Because it's really done it on Earth. So if you look at the difference between Earth and Mars, they're the classic examples. You know, Mars, cold, barren; Earth, completely complicated and full of all this amazing stuff. And that was, you know, 20, 15 years ago. And then I became more interested in what a particular species was doing on this particular planet. So, you know, what Homo sapiens had been doing since civilization, really. So I look at civilization as almost like a planetary scale phenomena, and I'm becoming more and more moved from sort of physical sciences to, let's say, social sciences, and along the way, I suppose, engagement and activism. So I get involved in a lot of, whether it's kind of net zero campaigns or Extinction Rebellion or Scientists for Rebellion, and so I'm also working on a project called Faculty for a Future, which is trying to work with academics and academia to try to get it a bit more empowered on the front foot for the crisis. Because academics are great at talking about what the problem is, but maybe not being part of the solution. They kind of throw it over the wall to society. There you go, society. There's knowledge. You know, what are you going to do about it? In terms of comms, so along with the, sorry, I've just got a, like 1 second. There's this really important phone call. Right, hang on a minute. Hang on. Right.
No problem. Yeah, while he's doing that, do you guys have any other questions that I can write down, or like things you struggle with in terms of climate science? Maybe. I'm going to say that you all need to come up with one question if you can. Not to put everyone on the spot, but let's try and do that. So you've got a while. Just like listen to everything he's saying, and then just come up with one as he talks. That's what I do. I don't think I'd be very good at engaging with the headline science at the moment, in terms of what is the actual boundaries and stuff. Oh, hi, James.
Sorry.
That's okay. Yeah, I was just saying that I'm not very good at recently I've kind of turned off from like what is the headlines of the planetary boundaries and things like that. Like, are we still saying 1.5? Where do we think we actually will get to? Blah blah blah, that kind of stuff. So if you've got any knowledge, well, you obviously do about that as well, that would be good.
Oh yeah, okay, that's my thing at the moment.
Yeah.
Right, so and over the since the last 10 years or so, I've been doing basically science journalism and writing and opinion editorial stuff. I used to do a bit for the Independent, and now I write for the I newspaper, and I've written for other publications. So I do a lot of that, because I thought one way of trying to address some of the gaps in academia, well, you get a bit more involved, directly involved with some of the messaging around the communications of science and climate change, and that's been interesting. It's been illuminating and kind of frustrating, but also I think ultimately empowering. And I can certainly talk about 1.5. At the moment, I'm interested in the narratives and the discussion around 1.5 and what this weird thing going on at the moment around 1.5 is still alive and not really doing anything that would limit warming to 1.5. And then also narratives of despair and doomism, you know, this feeling, well, nothing we do actually seems to matter, and therefore why bother with anything? And there is, you know, increasing concerns with young people's mental health around a lot of this, because a lot of it is unsettling, disturbing and frightening. Deep Adaptation, Dark Mountain, some of these organizations or communities almost that are giving a very strong line that somehow civilization collapse is inevitable, like that's it, you know, within the next 50 years or something, it's all over. So there's a lot of interest in this space. And I don't know what people are meant to make of it, because on the one hand, you've got people saying that it's the end of the world, and the other saying, don't worry about it, carry on flying. It's, you know, don't worry, we'll fix it. And yeah, it's a bizarre time in which to be alive. Right, okay, I can show you some bits and pieces, and then we can have a chat about it. Usually the QA is the most interesting thing, right? That's where we actually get into it. But I've got a few bits and pieces. Right, just gonna get presentation up. My computer wants to do that, right? And if I can, can you make me a co-host or enable me to share the screen?
What about now? Is that better?
Oh yeah, here we go. That looks good. Where is it? How does that look?
Yeah, it's all up. It's perfect.
A climate and ecological crisis, where we are heading, what's at stake? Well, pretty much everything. So we don't have to worry about that second part. Where we're heading, where are we now? Right, we've all seen that, right? We've all seen the show your stripes, the global warming thing. Yeah, right.
Yeah, I love it.
It's apparently it was first proposed by a woman, I think it was a woman, who did a lot of knitting, and she knitted the global temperature in the kind of series of lines, which Ed saw, and he thought, hey, that's a really good idea. Why don't we make that into a graphical representation? So it actually came from knitting, I gather. Anyway, right. So that's a representation of the change in the what we call the instrument record. So we've got direct measurements across the surface of the Earth, and there's really interesting science about how you can reconstruct global temperature, because you've got, you know, hundreds or thousands of thermometers, right, all over the world, and somehow all that data gets aggregated into a single temperature for the planet. There's an interesting, if you're a massive nerd, talk about how they do that, but let's assume you're not. And what we can say with significant confidence is that it's been getting warmer, right? That's why we're here. Yeah. If, depending on where you take the baseline, right, it's over 1 degree Celsius since pre-industrial periods, 1.2 degrees Celsius, right? That seems to be where we're going, and it's a very robust trend. You probably already know the warmest years on record are these. 2021 wasn't the warmest. I think it was still top 5 or 6. Currently we're in an El Nino period. There are these large scale changes in the climate between what we call the Enso, and at the moment El Nino is the warm one, and El Nino is slightly cooler. But that's one of the reasons why probably there is so much flooding in Australia at the moment. You know, the catastrophic flooding they've been having in Sydney and other places because of this large-scale change in the circulation of the heat and water or moisture in the Pacific. So given that it's kind of inevitable in the next few years that we'll end that stage and then maybe go into El Nino phase, it is inevitable that the warmest year will not be 2016, certainly in the next 5 years or so, because emissions are going up. And we know emissions are going up because we continue to put carbon dioxide into the Earth's atmosphere. The reason I show this slide for some talks is because some people still find it hard to process or acknowledge that we tiny humans have affected the climate of an entire planet. It's still, for them, they just can't get their head around it. But if you look at the planet from across the orbit of the International Space Station, so what's that, a couple of 200 miles above the surface, then this thin blue line is most of the Earth's atmosphere. It's a tiny thin film that blankets the Earth, and it's the cumulative emissions of greenhouse gases into that tiny thin film which has literally changed the radiative budget of the entire planet, right? So we're talking about incremental changes within a comparatively tiny film of matter. And that's because of the Industrial Revolution. Now I've got a long and complicated video, which is quite cool, but we're not going to watch. It's just lots of lines, really. This one's more interesting. I like this one. Anyone seen this? Maybe. It's not trending on TikTok. I don't think it ever will. This is the pump handle. I'll get it going. What we see here are lines of latitude. So there's the South Pole, there's the equator, and there's the North Pole. And these little dots correspond to these dots over here. And these are research stations. They're monitoring stations. This red one on the top of Mauna Loa, an extinct volcano in Hawaii, is there. And what it's monitoring is the concentrations of CO2 in the atmosphere. When we start the video in just before 1980s, Mauna Loa was registering 336 parts per million of carbon dioxide. So here we've got ppm on this vertical axis here. And you can see over time, a number of things are happening. We've got more and more dots because this is humanity waking up to the facts. The temperatures are increasing because of CO2 increasing. Therefore, we want to get more and more data about that. And the other thing you'll see is that it goes up and down. This is why they call it the pump handle. This idea that it's, it's kind of going up and down like that. And it goes up and down more towards the North Pole. Right? You can see there's a strong seasonal cycle. So if you look at the calendar going by April, July, October, January, and the reason it's going up and down a lot is if you look at the map here, think about where the equator is, so the middle of the Earth. Most of the Earth's land mass is to the north of the equator. So therefore, in the northern hemisphere summer, when the trees grow their leaves and the flowers bloom, they suck in carbon dioxide. And in the northern hemisphere, autumn and winter, when the trees drop their leaves and the vegetation dies back, they respire that CO2 back into the atmosphere. So this up and down motion is literally the biosphere breathing in carbon dioxide and breathing it out. All things being equal, the amount they breathe in would be the same that it breathes out. But over on this chart here, you can see all things are not equal. There's this strong sinusoidal or wibbly wobbly line. That's the annual signal, but you can see it's going up and up and up and up, right? And the reason it's going up and up and up is because of the emissions of CO2. There are natural flows of carbon dioxide, for example, out of volcanoes, right? And there are natural sinks of carbon dioxide. For example, the terrestrial biosphere, trees, which over time will store carbon in their tissues, and then also the oceans. The oceans absorb a tremendous amount of carbon dioxide. But the problem with what we call human-caused climate change or anthropogenic climate change, the rate at which we're putting carbon into the atmosphere is faster than the rate in which those natural sinks take it out. And if you've got more going in than is coming out, over time, it's going to go up. So you can see since pre-industrial periods, we've increased emissions from 278 parts per million to over 410 now. And each year, emissions will continue to go up until we stop emitting all carbon dioxide or all greenhouse gases. So we talk about the radiative forcing, the impacts that humans are having. Now, if you do go back much, much further, so for example, if you use ice cores, go to the Greenland ice sheet or Western Antarctica, then there is ice that's been laid down hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of years ago, and you can take a core of that ice and there are tiny bubbles, and then you can look at the fraction of carbon dioxide in those bubbles, then you can reconstruct climate change over hundreds of thousands of years, and then you get to the ice ages. At the bottom of the ice age, CO2 was as low as 185 parts per million, and it kind of went between 180 to about 280, and it's been doing that for quite a long time, maybe a couple of million years, right? So that means very, very large changes. And the difference between the top and the bottom of this, of a glacial or interglacial, is only about 5 degrees Celsius, right? So, and the difference in sea levels between this point and this point could be many, many tens of meters, 20 meters, 30 meters sea level rise. These are vastly different climates. So yes, the Earth's climate has changed over time, but when you look at over this time scale, what humans have done, basically it's geologically instant. It's like we've snapped our fingers and now we've driven the climate into a state it hasn't been in for many millions of years. And the climate is still catching up, right? It's still catching up. And it will continue to warm until we get to zero greenhouse gas emissions. We all know that. I'm going to skip that bit. That's basically, it's getting warmer. Right, basically, the hotter it is, the warmer it's getting. It starts from the kind of beginning of the 20th century. The only reason I show this is to demonstrate that average global temperatures of 1 degree Celsius, 1.2 degrees Celsius, yes, but it's not uniform. Most warming has actually been going up in the higher Arctic and the higher latitude here. It's a process called Arctic amplification. There's some regions of the Arctic that are warming 4, 5, 6, 7 times faster than the global average. And because the seas have so much mass, they've got so much, they act as a heat sink, most of the warming is happening on land. So one degree Celsius maybe doesn't sound very much, but you could think of the multiples of increases in land surface temperature in some parts of the world. And certainly if you're up in the Arctic, then it's getting much, much warmer, much more rapidly. And we can see that in human timescales. So here's 3 photographs taken at the same time of year in the same place. We're up in Glacier Bay National Park in Alaska. And you can see in 1940 that the glacier was extending all the way down to the bottom right of this photograph. By 1950 it melted back to there. 2004 is back to there, and I don't know where it is at the moment, but probably around that portion. And that's because as it's getting warmer, the ice is melting. You're affecting the mass balance of the glacier. Glaciers are continuing to produce by snow, which falls and then forms ice, which then flows down. And it's simply they can't produce as much snow and ice in order for it to be able to offset the amount of warming through a function of global increase in temperatures. So of the 190 something reference glaciers that are regularly monitored, the vast majority of them are receding like that. And you also heard about the decrease in Arctic sea ice area, right? So it's getting warmer up in the high latitudes. If it's Arctic amplification, then we can see that again in real time. So this is kind of instrument records where the extent of Arctic sea ice is decreasing. So it kind of it increases in the winter because it's get cold, and it melts in the summer, and it does this. But for many, many thousands of years, it was kind of in balance. It's only over the past couple of hundred years that we can see it's significantly reducing in area. It's also reducing in thickness. If we were to actually show the change in the thickness of Arctic sea ice, it'd actually look a lot worse because the ice is thinning, and the age of ice up there is becoming much, much younger. Basically, an increasing proportion of the amount of ice in the Arctic was only formed in the previous winter, and then it melts, and then you have a little bit more. And every year it's kind of like a ratchet where we're getting less and less. And you can see that if you reconstruct Arctic sea ice for, let's say, the last 1500 years, and then you put in the modern observations, and then the system is obviously headed towards, you know, a state in which there will not be ice in the Arctic in the summer. There will always be some freezing in the winter, but the amount that it freezes in the winter will just never be enough for it to be able to withstand the melt. And already we can see that's changing shipping lanes. So there are now direct shipping routes across the Arctic in the summer, some of which is being used to allow the extraction of more oil and gas. So that's why you've got some, you know, oil and gas companies are now beginning to prospect for hydrocarbons in the Arctic because the ice is out of the way. So that is a kind of a tipping system. It's a kind of classic tipping element, because once you lose a significant fraction of ice in the summer, you'll be exposing more dark seawater, which is going to absorb more energy from the sun, which is going to increase temperatures, which is going to, you know, so once it's gone, it's hard to get it back. And as you probably know, certainly if you've been a student at Exeter, you should know all about tipping element, because Tim Lenton and the Global Systems Institute have kind of done a lot of pioneering work. So this is the kind of classic 2008 paper from Tim et al. There's about 15 people on that paper from the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. Arctic sea ice is a tipping element. And there are a number. We're worried about the Amazon forest dying back. It's drying out, and at some point there's going to be increase in wildfires, which is going to reduce coverage further, which is going to further dry it out, which is going to make it more vulnerable to temperature and heat stress. We talked about the El Nino Southern Oscillation, the kind of La Nina, El Nino kind of issue. And there's some really interesting work going along at the moment with the Atlantic thermohaline circulation. Some people call it the Gulf Stream, you know, that transport, the advection of large amounts of energy, warm water that comes all the way up. It looks as if that's kind of wobbling and becoming unstable. And if that was to stop working, then obviously we would see significant climate change in Great Britain. Because think about where we are, we're kind of same latitudes as some countries that get really, really cold in the winter. You know, you think about how cold it gets into, you know, like Toronto or Moscow. The reason we've got such a relatively benign and mild climate is because of the Atlantic thermohaline circulation. So there are kind of global impacts, but there are also regional consequences as well. That sort of shows, in terms of temperature, not CO2 emissions, what we've kind of done in about a century. I might skip over some of this bit because I want to get to the discussion, but if you haven't heard of a guy called Jim Hansen, then you should, because it was Jim Hansen when he was director of NASA's Goddard Institute, which was a kind of institute between NASA and Columbia University. He gave a testimony in 1988 in which he basically laid out to US politicians, we can see that temperatures are warming, we can understand temperatures increasing, we can see increases in carbon dioxide concentrations. We've got a good understanding what that's going to mean for the temperatures. And so if you don't rapidly decrease fossil fuel use, we're going to see what we could consider to be dangerous climate change. That did spur some political action. So you've got the 1992 Rio Declaration and the Earth Summit. And the idea that for decades, politicians, pretty much of all hue really, have agreed that the ultimate objective is to stabilize greenhouse gases such that they prevent dangerous, right? And there's been a lot of arguing about what is dangerous, what constitutes dangerous, but there's no real dispute that we're changing the climate, or the changes that we see in the climate are responsible for us, and we continue to emit further greenhouse gases, then we're going to change it even further in ways that will be dangerous for us and for a very, very long time. Remember, the CO2 stays active in the climate system for centuries, right? So once we put it up there, it's up there pretty much until we can figure out ways to take it out. And the reason we care about this is because as average global temperatures here increase, then it's going to affect our ability to get potable water for drinking, water for agriculture. It's going to impact ecosystems. It's going to make it harder to grow food. Coastal communities will be displaced because they will literally be underwater. And we also expect to see changes in health impacts. The distribution of like diseases, certain types of vector-borne diseases, increases in dysentery, all that adds up into dangerous, right? It's things that we don't want to experience, and it all pretty much gets worse as we increase from 0 degrees to 5 degrees, and we are currently at a little over 1 degree Celsius. And for many years, the international community agreed it was 2 degrees, right? 2 degrees is when we want to limit it. Until Paris 2015, where we kind of said, well, 2 degrees isn't actually safe. It's 1.5. 1.5 degrees Celsius represents dangerous climate change for various reasons. One reason is beyond 1.5 degrees Celsius, some low-lying island nations probably wouldn't exist because they'd be literally underwater. And also, if you look at the risk of ecosystems and food systems beyond 1.5, it really does look a bit sketchy, right? We've said all that. Yes, basically it's all bad and it's not going to get any better. If you're looking for things to read, then certainly the climate change impacts, adaptation and vulnerability report is a good one. So the IPCC, every 4-ish years or so, they release their assessment reports. They're AR reports, and we've just gone through AR6. And they are essentially 3 working groups. The first one is on the physical basis and the science. The second one is, okay, so what does that mean? What's it going to do to us? Which is impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability. And the third one is, what do we think we can do about it? Which is all about how you can mitigate greenhouse gas emissions. But this one is good. It's basically, it begins to explain, well, why is 1.5 dangerous? Why is going beyond 2 degrees Celsius dangerous? I really recommend that. And so this is another way of looking at, what they used to call the fire diagram, our ability to access, food, water systems, biodiversity loss, structural change, tree mortality, the impacts we're going to have on ecosystems. As you go beyond 1.5 here, everything's becoming increasingly red, right? Since we're going further into the danger zone. Now, despite all of that, and the thing that we want to think about for the rest of this session, I think, is, so what are we doing about it? Right, so here was Hansen in 1988, yeah, on the left-hand side of the chart. Unless we stop emitting greenhouse gases, we're going to further drive the climate into the dangerous state. And here we are in 2021. And since Hansen's testimony, we've put more carbon dioxide into the Earth's atmosphere than we did before Hansen's testimony in the dawn of the Industrial Revolution 200-300 years ago, right? So there's actually been a significant increase in acceleration in greenhouse gas emissions just because the global economy is bigger. There's been more industrialization and development. There was some optimism around 2020, if you could call it that, because of the depths of the COVID lockdowns. We thought, well, we've turned all the fossil fuel infrastructure off for lockdowns. Last thing we want to do is turn it back on again. So we'll just build back better. Well, we didn't. There's been a rebound. 2021 saw the second largest annual increase in greenhouse gas emissions ever, just because we untethered the global economy and it's launched forward. And that's part of the problem we've got with inflation and availability of goods and services. We literally can't produce things fast enough. So it's still the case that the majority of energy is supplied by fossil fuels. Do I actually say it's 80%? No, I don't, right. So if I just go back, if you look at global emissions, land use change is slightly reduced, we think, because we think we're getting a little bit on top of deforestation in tropical regions, right? Coal use has certainly increased, oil, gas, and fossil fuels still provide 80% of all of humanity's energy requirement. And that is almost exactly the same proportion as it was 10 years ago. So 10 years ago, fossil fuels supplied 80% of total human energy needs. Today, they supply 80%. And the reason that fraction isn't changing is because even though there's been vast deployments of wind, wave, solar, renewables, there's also been a commensurate increase in total energy demand because of economic development, because of more energy and material consumption, right? So it's kind of like trying to, the treadmill is running fast, going faster and faster. You're having to run faster and faster just to keep up. So that's kind of what we've been doing, right? What we need to do, as well as deploy the renewables, we need to get that down to zero. Until we get that down to zero, emissions will continue, concentrations will continue to go up, and we will see continued warming, right? So it's a global problem, but it's not a global driver. About the richest 10% of humanity, and that includes me, right? I don't think I'm very rich, but globally, I'm certainly in the richest 10%, are responsible for about half of all consumption-based emissions. So there's a very strong correlation between the amount of carbon dioxide or greenhouse gases that you emit, your impact on the climate, and your wealth. Because once you might think you're being green by not having a straw and a keep cup, right? Certainly if you've got a big house, if you've got a big car, if you go multiple holidays each year, you have a large and expanding ecological footprint, and also you're just driving further economic activity, economic growth. The poorest 50% of the global population don't really emit anything, right? So here's another way of looking at that. So here's a rescaling of the Earth's surface, and you can see the outlines of the countries. And what we've done, we've rescaled it in the context of total contribution to global warming. So this is cumulative emissions. So remember, emissions stay up in the atmosphere for centuries. So the CO2 that the UK produced at the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, an awful lot of it is still up there. So when you look at cumulative emissions and you rescale countries, you can see the UK is surprisingly big. United Kingdom, Germany, France, obviously United States and China. If you look at sub-Saharan African nations, you can barely see many of them. I can't even really see some of them, right? Because they just haven't really produced anything like the cumulative emissions. Rescale it another way, and suddenly it's those nations that completely dominate. Indian subcontinent, certain nations in Central Southeast Asia, and now you can barely see the United Kingdom. United States becomes a little stick figure. Because what you're rescaling here now is the change in mortality rate as a consequence of climate change. So this is essentially the additional number of people that are dying as a consequence of the 1.1, 1.2 degrees Celsius of warming that we've already produced. And those impacts fall disproportionately on the global south because they haven't undertaken anything like the industrialization development that we have. So they don't have the resources to be able to deal with it. It's hot, put some air conditioning in. Well, they can't afford it, or there's not the infrastructure to do it, or the energy infrastructure to do that. And it's also, they are in the most affected regions. They're in the tropical regions, the places that will get the most extreme heat, that will get the most extreme humidity, that will experience the most devastating storms, hurricanes, typhoons, flooding, right? So this shows the fundamental issues around climate justice, and that those most responsible for the problem are being least affected, whereas it's those who are least contributing to the problem are having to pick up the tab. And that's why 1.5 degrees Celsius for some of these nations is existential. 1.5 isn't existential for the UK, probably 2 degrees isn't. It becomes increasingly uncomfortable, but we've got the wealth, we've got the knowledge, we've also got the military power in order to be able to secure food security, water security, energy security. But that is by far and away not a universal claim that you can make. In fact, the majority of humanity is extremely vulnerable to further environmental change. So what do we need to do for 1.5? Well, we should have done it 30 years ago. Basically, this shows what we would need to do in order to reduce emissions from something like the current 45 billion tons a year down to zero. We need to get it to zero, right? Until we get it to zero, temperature is going to increase. So now if we want about a 66% chance, we're going to have to essentially reduce emissions instantly. Sorry, I'm being continually phoned by my sons who are on their way back from school, and I'm asking them, "Are you okay?" And they're just not replying to my my text messages. They never do. It's very frustrating. And you ask them, "What's the matter? What's the matter?" Oh, nothing. Oh, fucking right. Anyway, so I might have to pick the phone up in a bit, but so basically, there's no carbon budget left for 1.5, right? So then, how do people say 1.5 is still alive? Right? How can politicians say after COP26, we just need a little bit more political will, we can do it? Well, the reason is that we are proposing that we're going to take carbon out of the atmosphere, right? So these things called SSPs, these are just scenarios, possible futures. So if you carry on with burning all the fossil fuels that we can get, we'll end up with 5 degrees Celsius or 4 degrees Celsius by the end of this century. And if we do that, it's the end of civilization, I'm afraid, right? But we are not so incredibly stupid to do that. And we can see we probably diverged from that path. We're not going to burn all the coal, right? So that's good news. That's positive, right? That's really good. What we would need to do for below 2 degrees Celsius or well below 2 degrees Celsius is get down here. And you can see, do I do this here? Right. So you can see that means by the middle of the century, we don't only stop emitting carbon dioxide, but we actually start taking it out. We go net negative, right? So that's what 1.5 and arguably even 2 degrees Celsius means now. It doesn't mean just stopping greenhouse gas emissions. It means net negative. So when you hear net zero, they don't actually mean net zero. They're kind of meaning net negative. We need to draw out more carbon. How much? Well, some of these scenarios propose that we're going to remove as much carbon from the atmosphere by the end of this century as we are emitting it right now. Obviously, that's not my problem because I won't be around. That's your problem. That's my kids' problem, right? And we're going to do that through a number of ways, and obviously blah, right, civilization. I might skip through some of these bits because these are really quite wonkish. Ways forward, I'm going to skip that as well because it's quite prescriptive. I want to talk to you about ways forward. So that's where we are. That's what we're signing up to with net zero. That's what we think we need to do in order to limit warming to 1.5. That's why I'm very skeptical, and I've been quite outspoken about the fact that we're not going to limit warming to 1.5. It's very difficult to find anyone who works on climate science and climate policy who thinks we will limit to 1.5. So I think there is a disconnect between what happens in academia and what the public understand. 1.5 is gone. Dangerous warming is inevitable, and we need to undertake very, very large changes in order to make sure we don't warm even further, like beyond 2 degrees Celsius. At the moment, in my opinion, and this might be something we could talk about, the message is don't worry. Incremental processes, incremental policy, nudges, a bit of a tax here is sufficient to keep us safe, and there's no need to do anything fundamentally different. And I suppose I would fundamentally disagree with that. So there we are.
No, that was great. Thank you. I have one technical question that I think I've forgotten from my geography degree already, which is a bit worrying. So if we stopped emitting absolutely all greenhouse gases right now, like literally just turned everything off, would it still increase? Like the parts per million in the atmosphere, would that still increase? Okay. Even if we stop the sources? Yeah,
so the basis of net zero is some really cool science that I didn't talk about, which is if we tomorrow stopped all emissions, so we stopped all carbon dioxide and methane, basically we just stopped all greenhouse gas actually let's keep it to carbon dioxide. If we stopped all carbon dioxide emissions, what would happen is that natural sinks such as the forests and the oceans, which absorb carbon dioxide, and ocean marine systems, they would slowly drag the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. So what we would see, that increase in CO2 that we've been seeing, since industrialization, that would stabilize, and then very, very slowly it would start to go down, right? Hooray, right? But temperatures wouldn't go down, right? It's a quirk of the physics, but what would happen is the CO2 went down, the extra heat that the climate system has been absorbing, mostly in the oceans, that heat would then start to get released. So the releasing heat would kind of offset the reductions in CO2. So basically temperatures would stabilize, right? So they would stay fixed for a very long time. We're talking about century timescales. So if you want to stop warming at 1.2, end emissions tomorrow. If you want to stop it at 1.5, end emissions in about 5 to 10 years time. If you want to stop it at 2, at current rates. So that's where the whole idea of net zero comes from, rather.
Okay. Feel free to take your call if you want. We can.
I tell you what, just do a quick huddle and see what questions you got, and then I've just got a phone because I don't know if anything is actually anything amiss.
Yeah, it's all good.
I'll be like a minute, I promise.
Yeah. I want to know everyone's bets about where, and obviously we're all like students, so we're not going to have the best answer. But where do you think, how many degrees warming do you think we'll get to? Because I think we're when they had that graph up, it's kind of hard to visualize now, but I think I'm looking at 2.5, 2.6. I want to hear everyone's bets. It's a bit of a morbid game, but
it's quite morbid, but I'd probably go 3 degrees.
Okay, 3 degrees.
Oh my god, I don't want to live in that world. But yeah, 2.5, I think.
Okay.
I'm going to be slightly optimistic and go between 2 and 2.5.
Okay. Kimberly?
I think between 2.5 and 3.
Okay, cool. So then we're going to ask James when he comes back and see what he says. Does anyone know, are we in El Nino or La Nina right now? Because I couldn't remember what he said.
I think it's El Nino.
Okay, and that's the warmer one. So then I was thinking, if this is the warmer one, then would there still be records in the next 5 years if the system is pushing towards cold, but we're still emitting? I don't know. I'm not sure.
Sorry, can you say your question again?
Yeah, so if we're in El Nino, so that's meant to be the warm bit, the warm part of the two halves, and then when we move to La Nina and it goes colder, but we're still emitting, will temperatures still be rising? or would they kind of plateau for that half, and then when we get back to El Nino again, then it would jump?
So obviously he'll know more, but from my understanding of the science, no, it's not going to get better. It's going to get worse because of the circulation in the ocean.
Okay, so even though we're in the warmer bit, it's still gonna, I guess, because it's like the consequences of like the flooding and all of that. So yeah, okay. Does everyone have a question to ask him? Because we can brainstorm now if you want.
I've got a few.
That's good.
So you mentioned briefly about the faculty in the future that use part of.
Hi.
I'm back. Right, this drama over.
Okay, great.
Right.
We were all betting. It's quite a morbid bet, but we were all betting. Where do we think we're going to end up? Like, how many degrees warming? And we had a range from like 2 to 3-ish. And so, where's your bet?
Man, who voted 3? Who was the player? Wow. You're one of those people, you go to parties, they're kind of the depressed person on the stairs.
That's you.
I'll be like that, James.
Well, to be honest, when I about 10 years ago, that you would have spoken to people, they would have gone, yeah, about 3, maybe 3 at least, because there was an awful lot of skepticism. Because 10 years ago, there wasn't, the political situation was very, very different. There was still resistance in the main political parties that this is an issue that they should really, at least now, a decade on, it's hard to find any of the kind of, there are those swivel-eyed loons who just say, oh, it's not warming. And, look at Steve Baker, right? He's emerged out of the Conservative Party. He's Suella Braverman or Cruella Baker, but, watch what goes on in the Conservative Party leadership context, because you will see come to the surface are some really real good old-fashioned climate deniers. Absolutely, they are good, and what they'll do is Steve Baker heads up an organization called Net Zero Watch, which is a rebrand of the Global Warming Policy Foundation, which is founded by ex-Chancellor Nigel Lawson back in the whenever, and it's got a load of fossil fuel money, and it's there's a very large stream still in right-wing politics, and of course in the United States, right? But other large fossil fuel producing nations, Australia is a particular pernicious example, where they just either they don't care or they're anyway. 10 years on, I think there are reasons to be more optimistic that it's not going to be 3, right? So the most optimistic, you'll see that, well, maybe 2.5 or something. That said, right, there was a survey conducted by Nature last year, the science journal Nature, and it did an anonymous poll for IPCC, current and past IPCC lead authors for climate science, like Working Group 1. And they said, they gave them a number of options as to what do you think is most likely. The majority thought 3 degrees Celsius by the end of the century was most likely. And in terms of how likely they thought, for the proportion of people who thought 1.5 was likely, I think it was 4%. No one thinks it's likely, right? Now, one of the reasons there's such pronounced skepticism for climate scientists around 1.5 is because you look at now the way in which we're meant to get to 1.5 or limit to 1.5, it's not all. It's so much work carbon removal needs to do, like negative emissions, whether it's bioenergy or direct air capture. And you look at the science and it's just nowhere near it, right? You'd have to see it scaling up thousands and thousands of times, the most wildest extrapolations. So that's why there's such pronounced skepticism about it. I don't think it's they're very skeptical about the fact that we couldn't radically reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but the plans that we've got to do, which is, these kind of future machines, means it's just not going to happen, right? So in terms of the academic community, probably somewhere between 2.5 and 3. But there might be a bit more optimism that we can bend the curve, right? So if that's where we are, we can bend the curve round. And it's this really strange situation at the moment where there are 2 different groups of people, right? There are the people who've been involved in climate policy or science for decades who would, almost look a bit, not chirpy, right? But they're like, oh yeah, you know, there's good news, right? At the same time as we're blowing past 1.5, and then you've got a whole bunch of people freaking out about the fact we're going past 1.5 and even 2, right? And they're going, wow, you know, good news, good news. And, you know, because they're coming from a completely different place, because they never thought we were going to limit warming to 1.5. They've never been, it's not they don't want it, they just never thought that was ever possible. They've been at 3, so they're kind of coming down from 3, right? So obviously that's progress, whilst other people are sort of, oh God. Other people are kind of, other people are sort of coming up from trying to limit, you know, to 1.5. So there's this weird, discordant kind of mix in the middle that I'm not sure what we're meant to be doing about.
Fair enough. Fair enough. If people have questions, go ahead. Megan, maybe you go, because you said you had a couple.
Hello, I've got a few. So James,
Okay.
you mentioned about the faculty for future
Yeah.
that you're working with, and I think at some point mentioned, I've not got this exactly right, something along the lines of there's got to be like a fine line between publishing a paper and spending a night in jail in terms of
Yeah.
like what do we do? And I'm just wondering, like, what is that line? I've always wondered, like, what do we do?
Yeah. I think everyone's answer to that question will be different, because everyone has got different things that they can do. For some people, direct protest comes as a result of them just either running out of patience or being genuinely motivated by, you know, concerns, and they just don't see anything else they could do to rapidly move things forward, right? Other people, it's they go and join like a big international NGO or charity, or they'll go and find a local group and they'll try and do something. Others will be they'll sell their car, or they will you know, they will try and work out how they could do a car share, or they'll figure out how they could cycle to work or something. It's I think one way to look at it is that there is so much low hanging fruit in order to make things better, given how bad the situation is, right? There are so many things that we could do which could have an immediate impact. And it sounds trite, but every little bit does matter, right? So you can, whether it's your own personal behavior change, whether it's just changing, modifying the diet a bit, changing travel habits a bit, changing consumption patterns a bit, or spending a bit more time trying to engage with other people and tell them why it's important, or support campaigns, or, you know, petition MPs. You know, there's a million and one things to do. There's not just one, right? There's not just one thing. No, that sounds fine, right? And fine and good. I mean, the thing I didn't talk about in the presentation is Hansen, right? So Hansen has got a really interesting story. So he was probably, you know, the most well-known climate scientist in the 80s and 90s because of his testimony, and he became almost like a figurehead of academia and the importance of science speaking to society. And then, you know, when was it? It would have been about 25 years later. He was arrested outside the US White House for protesting against oil pipelines. It was a direct non-violent protest, and he was arrested again because he just got to the point when he spent the best part of 30 years just, you know, trying to tell people the how serious or dangerous the situation is, and essentially, at least in the US political class, being ignored. And for him, that's what he felt he wanted or thought he would be able to do constructively. And it certainly did, you know, it did move the dial. You know, when Greta decided to sit down with a poster, you know, that led on to other things. I think we can get a little bit wishful thinking that protest is going to be sufficient, and it's not, right? Part of the problem is it's not that we don't have the technologies or the wherewithal to transition to sustainable energy systems. A large part of the problem is that there are incredibly powerful entities and organizations that don't want to stop using fossil fuels because they've got all that power through burning fossil fuels. So, you know, it's still the fact that some of the world's most wealthiest and powerful corporations are fossil fuel corporations, right? And it's no surprise that they not going to wake up one day because the IPCC published a report and go, you know what, we're just going to get all out of oil and gas. It's right. It's about power and politics, and it's really difficult. But what we've got to do somehow keep open that space of being honest about where we are, being honest about what is very likely to happen, and then not losing the sense of agency that we can still do something about it. I think it's an absolute tragedy if people think, well, that's it, we're doomed. Because if nothing else, that just becomes a self-perpetuating, scenario. Because if we don't do something about it, then we probably will end up in a very, very bad place.
Megan, do you want to? Oh, I was good. Yeah, no, I completely agree. Half the thing is about like, especially kind of younger people, is go protest and all of that. And it's weird to know how to do more than that, especially if we were all coming from academic. We've like kind of dipped in with uni. It's kind of like idea of where you could go. You could stay in academics and do all of that. It's almost like a trial of like whether you want to keep going with that or not. It's very difficult to know whether to keep going with that or try other ways, and it sometimes comes across that it's like a path and you go one way or the other. You can't do both as well, which I think is quite interesting. I think I know quite a lot of people like that, whether you do the science or you do the politics or you go protest and be on the outside of it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I don't know.
I think you should do all.
Yeah.
I think it's a real tragedy. We get people to specialize, right? You're a scientist, right? You're someone who works on policy. And one thing that I think you should do is you should demand more of your institution, more of your university. What is it meant to be doing, right? I mean, universities, and this university can be really influential. We can exert, not just through education, but above and beyond that. But that said, I think some of the educational programs are woefully lacking. We've got students who can go through their entire degree program and not really know anything about the climate and ecological crisis. Obviously they've heard about it, but they don't really understand. And I'm not just talking about the science. Somebody turns up and gives them a chart and everything. What it means. Where does this problem come from? What does it mean if we can actually reduce harm? Who are the most vulnerable, right? And I'm not talking about compulsory lectures every week. But if you're thinking about what do we need to do for young people or for students at university, obviously we're giving you the knowledge and the skills, the capacity to be able to make a success of your life, right? And it's likely that the way in which the crisis unfolds over the rest of your life will be a really, really important factor in what you do, where you do it, right? And so if we're not giving you the tools,
exactly, yeah,
ability to be able to not just survive it, but actually thrive in it and shape it and make it, then I just think what we're doing is utterly inadequate. And to be honest, I look at some of the things we teach, and it's like, what a waste of your time. It's like that's not. There is still too much in academia, and I think if you talk to any academic, you'll find this. They're all trying to make mini-me's. The job of going to university is not to make little proto-academics, it's to empower people to go out and make a positive contribution and make a success of their life, right? And there is too much kind of, the curriculum gets ossified, and we teach it because we've always taught it, right? And there's not enough actually reflecting what people need right now. And certainly as the situation develops, we're going to have to be much, much more agile like that. So I think you should demand much more from a university like that.
No, exactly, especially with the kind of money as well, how much money they've got, and even just in Exeter as a city, and the they've got as well worldwide, being at COP and being one of the only unis there to give all this information. It was just crazy. Yeah. Anyone else with questions? I don't want to take it all up. Oh yeah, Michelle, you're on mute.
Sorry, I'm struggling with this button all day today. Hi. Yeah, sorry, I have quite a few questions, and they're like a bit interrelated, so it's just like I had to organize that in my head for a second. Yeah, so I'm curious because so I'm a PhD student, probably looking to go into like some kind of like climate policy after I finish, even though I do astrophysics. But like, so it's interesting to me. So like for you as a scientist, what do you think, or what do you feel like about the movement, or like the climate crisis movement that isn't being communicated properly? Because for example, like I think there's quite a few things like the like I feel like we're kind of always backtracking the scientific community on climate crisis. Like we come out with things like we say, oh, 1.5 degrees heating, the climate is being raised by that amount, and then people are like, oh, but my tiny village doesn't have a 1.5 degree increase, it's actually gone. And then we have to be like, oh, no, this is a global thing, so actually what it means is this, and like we have to do that. And like I kind of see that coming as well with like this, we're probably going to hit 2 degrees. And then I think people are going to be like, oh, but it's been 1.5. That means that I can lose all hope and I can, I don't know, binge eat chicken wings while I fly for 15 hours from LAX to Australia because there's no hope left. Like, you know what I mean? Like, so how, as a scientist, what do scientists need to do to like up their communication, but at the same time still get these kind of taglines out there to galvanize and communicate to the direct public?
Okay, interesting question.
Sorry, there's a lot there.
There's I think we now understand it's not because there's an information deficit. For a while we just thought, well, give people the right information and they'll behave. It's like that was kind of naive for a number of reasons. One reason it was naive is because you are working in a space in which you've got incredibly powerful and really, really effective actors that want to rubbish everything that you do, like the merchants of doubt kind of playbook that the tobacco industry used. So if you look at Exxon and Shell and the kind of groups and organizations they've been funding, anything you can do to sow doubt and undermine the science. And so it's been a completely asymmetric war in some respects. And you read anything from Michael Mann, you'll get that kind of first generation climate science warrior type thing. I think the most important thing that we can do as scientists is work with policymakers and also community organizers, community practitioners, understand from them what it is that they need, right? So it's a much more kind of co-production model, right? The idea that the idea of climate comms is you just need to keep shouting at them until they understand, or shout at them in different fonts or with slightly different colors or something. There's got to be something that lands. And really the issue is contextualizing climate change. What does it mean? And it doesn't have to mean everything for everyone, right? My argument when it comes to making the kind of changes that we might need behaviorally, like the things that people do individually, but then also supporting larger scale policy initiative, is that you might not really want to situate it in the context of global climate crisis or global climate justice, but you might want to say, do you want to improve air quality in your community, therefore reduce the number of vehicles or internal combustion engines? Do you want to improve? Do you want to reduce noise pollution? Do you want to make a more livable seat? Do you want to take over some of this space which is being concrete and tarmac for cars and make more local parks? Do you want to increase community engagement? You work out what people want. Like livable cities or 20-minute communities initiatives that are really powerful because they understand what gets people excited. We just show them a picture of somewhere or we give them a vision of a future. And do you want to live there? And it's like, yeah, that's great. It's safe. It's quiet. I can walk around. And you don't need to fly away in order to escape all the time. You don't need a larger wall to keep everybody out and to protect all your kind of private possessions. So there's really exciting and interesting new avenues, I think, that we can, as scientists, work with those kind of practitioners and people who have a much, much better understanding of what makes people tick, right? Because you can give the most dystopian, terrifying kind of scenarios, and it either doesn't land, or you just put people into defensive mode or denial, and eventually we'll get through it. Yeah, but eventually we run out of time, right? We don't have time for this kind of very long, drawn out process. So we should be looking for, the kind of win-wins and the positive stories without downplaying where we are. And I think moral framings are really important as well. It's wrong to take more than your fair share. It's wrong to hurt people. It's wrong to steal young people's futures, right? That's got, obviously it's underpinned by the science, but how it lands and what it means to people. And just on that last point, So I'm doing a small project at the moment that's trying to understand, what is it about the Ukraine crisis that strongly motivates people? People are taking in strangers. They're willing to pay more for their energy because Russia's going to turn the gas off. They're willing to use less energy because Russia's willing to turn the gas off. In the climate context, they've been doing these things that we've been trying to get them to do for decades, right? So what is it? And for some people, they're motivated to do that because they're worried about escalation, or there's a kind of a humanitarian type context. But I think a really, really important difference between the Ukraine crisis and the climate crisis is that people intuitively understand that the Ukraine crisis is wrong. It's morally wrong, right? And once people understand something is wrong, they can be tremendously motivated to do something. It's kind of a phenomenon called costly punishment. Somebody sees something that's wrong, they will willingly spend their money. They will sometimes put themselves in jeopardy to stop it, even though it's got nothing to do with them, right? So there's a really important framing that we've got there that's empowering people. If you can find that kind of moral framing for the climate crisis, it's wrong, right? They've got to be stopped, or the system has got to be stopped, right? I think you could probably empower people in ways that thus far we've really struggled.
If I can add on to that, I think what your question about Ukraine versus climate crisis, there is like a tangible enemy with Ukraine. There is a place to direct it, whereas I think when you say system change to the general public, that is very like hippie, like, oh, the system, like blah blah blah, invisible. Whereas Ukraine, you're like, oh, Putin, Russia, and like whether that's wrong or right, because Russia is obviously, like it's visible and it's there. And I think if people manage to direct it at politicians and like actual individuals and like name and shame, that probably helps as well. That's what came to mind about the whole Ukraine thing, is there's an enemy.
Have you read Ministry for the Future? Right?
No.
That's really good. It's Kim Stanley Robinson's. It's not his latest. He's done another one on mountains or something since. But it's I like Kim Stanley Robinson. He's a US author, science fiction mainly, but he writes a lot kind of climate informed. And he writes this book in which he basically tries to outline what could be the solution to the climate crisis. And there's kind of, the UN sets up this Ministry for the Future, which tries to work with governments in order to really accelerate the transition to low carbon societies. But there was a secret hidden wing, which was all about direct action, which is all about targeting organizations. And in some instances, it was actually about targeting individuals. It got very dark, right? And so I know people get very worried when you begin to say, okay, so what is the enemy? Right, it's the CEO of this energy company, or it's this particular politicians or something. We don't, in some respects, we don't want more heat in a very, very febrile political kind of situation. But it's really, really interesting how he narrates, and other people have been thinking about this, how you've got, the mainstream wing, but then you've got this radical wing. At the moment, they call them terrorists. There's a US citizen that's been, I think she's been jailed for 10 years or something on the charge of terrorism because she was disrupting an oil pipeline. She was essentially vandalism, right? But they're being labeled as terrorists because they're attacking key critical infrastructure. And that's probably only going to increase, right? You can see that being those kind of moves in the UK with, Insulate Britain and Just Stop Oil, those kind of direct non-violent protests. It's not just criminal damage anymore. They're beginning to, the system is beginning to respond in such ways that it wants to protect itself from these kind of, disruptive forces.
I've recently read that book, and I actually found that book more depressing after I read it, because I was like, that's not going to happen though. No one is going to shoot Jeffrey Bezos, even though he should be. And that was so depressing to me.
Well, I mean, I think there's lots
for
of
legal reasons. I did not say that.
There's lots of on camera.
You're on recorded. You're on recording. I'll delete that bit.
That was a satirical.
Oh my God! Please do.
So that was a satirical comment, and there's more than one ways to affect that kind of change. I think, absolutely. So again, it's about holding open that space, because there is so much fear around it. What's going to happen when it goes wrong? Well, it's just going to be like nationalism and isolationism and protectionism, and the razor wire is going to get thrown up, and we're going to try and there's I mean, in my opinion, I think that's why a lot of people find it very hard to talk about post 1.5, because they just don't even want to even go there. They're kind of in denial about not just what it means, but the sorts of discussions we will have to have. But the thing is, we don't do it now and get organized now. In 5-10 years time, when it actually does happen, that's too late, right? It's too late. And don't think that humanity will suddenly come to its collective senses once we get past 1.5 or something. That tiny fraction of humanity that is essentially still holding us up will just double down on what they did previously, right? They're not going to have that epiphany, and they're not going to suddenly give up. They're just going to work much, much harder. So that means we have to work harder.
No, that's really great. There's we read Burn, a chapter of Burn by Chris Saltmarsh before, and the quote I pulled out, it said, yeah, it's still on here on my thing. He said, "The COVID-19 pandemic has shown what bosses are prepared to put their workers through during a crisis." And I think that's just like a light bulb moment for me, is see, everything that happened, like the Amazon warehouses and blah, blah, blah. Like, yeah, anyway, that's just a comment on it. I'm thinking it's 10 past, so we might need to wrap up.
Oh, yeah, I've got somewhere to be, yeah.
Yeah, it's okay. No problem. But it's been amazing. It's been really good. And I think because we've got your contact, maybe if you could expect a couple of emails from people with the rest of the questions, I think that would be, if that's good with you.
I'm happy to follow up on email, yes. Email for me is a little bit tricky at times because my inbox is ridiculous.
Yeah.
But if you want to, further sessions or something, or how you want to develop this, I think it's all great. And the other thing, there's lots going on, but I'm still finding it every day, and somehow we need to work with each other to find out what it is that you want to just get involved in. Because if nothing else, just doing something is tremendous for your sense of well-being. It's like, even if you think it's all pointless, and I don't think it is, but even if you did, just getting involved with other people, even if it's just a moan at them, or you have a good old joint moan, but it can be much, much more empowering, and you feel you're doing something. And there's nothing worse than just sitting in it and feeling all passive, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, but it's good because what you were talking about, it's going to link to a lot of the other workshops we've got in following weeks. I mean, we've got Stuart Barr in a few days on behavioural change.
Oh yeah, Stuart's great.
Yeah, he is. And then I'm going to do one on the well-being, and then we've got someone's doing one on how to find your place. Like, it all links, so it'll be good. But yeah,
awesome.
Yeah. But thank you so much for giving us your time and everything. It's really great.
Thanks for having me, and I will be in touch.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Okay, take care all.
Bye.
Bye.
That was good. I like him. Does anyone have any comments or questions about anything he said? Do you like the scientific approach of it, or I know they're all related, but do you like that, or do you prefer the social side of it, more like social movement side of it? Do you know what I mean? Is there a bit you prefer for any of you?
I mean, for me personally, I've always kind of, sorry, Martha, I've always kind of been down the scientific route, but I think now I'm shifting more towards this intersection between physical and the social sciences, and becoming a part of a movement. Ultimately, climate crisis is, we should have people at the front of it, I think. So yeah, I think I'm kind of shifting slowly.
Martha, yeah.
I see what, I agree with what you said, Megan, there, but also I said sometimes I find that when things get said about definitions of words, I think having the science to give examples and explain things further help, because sometimes again, if someone asks me a question, I feel like I'm just stating just making statements and not actually being able to thoroughly explain things. So having the balance of the science and cases and examples does help, I think.
Sometimes I found that when I've got a big to-do list of everything I want to do, sometimes I do the scientific stuff, whether that was for uni or not, because I actually found it easier because it's a bit less emotional. I'm not sitting there absolutely stressing over a human thing, because I can sometimes take it out of it, and I know that's not the permanent solution, but I don't know. Sometimes I'll be like, I'm going to do my uni work because it's numbers. Yeah. Okay. Let me think. We're going to do a how do you feel? That's what Emma recommended. So I'm still feeling optimistic, even though we had a kind of crazy course on the death of the planet kind of thing. So I'm still feeling optimistic. How about everyone else?
Yeah, I'm still also feeling pretty optimistic. It feels like there's a lot of we have a lot of options. Like some are even though they can be quite seemed unattainable, it's not like we have this one option, one solution that we have to go towards. There's lots of different pathways that we can take, which
Anyone else? You can do like a optimistic, or pessimistic. You're okay to be pessimistic. But I'm like here, maybe like here.
Yeah, I sort of feel like I didn't hear anything that I wasn't expecting, sort of thing. Like maybe I was already pessimistic, and now it's just like, yeah, I feel the same. Like I feel the same way as I did before. I kind of thought it would be like, yeah, I'm quite familiar with the science, so it wasn't like new to me. But I think it was optimistic in what he was saying, that like you need kind of all sections of society to do whatever they can do. So like it's not just like, for example, I am not from this country. I cannot do the protests like Extinction Rebellion do. I can't go to jail because I will lose my home here. So things like that. So it's nice to hear that there is like more than we need multiple avenues of, I guess, like attacking in order to get like the results that we want as a movement. Yeah.
I think it's nice to have someone like him come on, because he's obviously very well respected in his field, like he's influential, and you want to look up to someone and just kind of tell you what to do. So it's nice for him to not be like, don't do that, like you need to do loads of different things. It's quite nice, because then you're not like, like you feel it's just a bit more, I don't know, it makes me feel a bit better, because I don't know whether I'll go science or whether I'll do like other kinds of things. So that was quite nice. I had a resource that I thought, because you're all scientists, you would like it. It's okay. I'll put it in the chat and then you can take a picture of it. It's called, it's called The Republican War on Science. So it's good. Yeah. Okay. So it's a book about obviously American politics, and how since the 80s there's been multiple different areas of science. So the tobacco industry, or the Clean Air Act, environmental, blah blah blah, loads of stuff. I think even like abortion and fertility is all in there as well. And how it's been like a systematic attack on science, and how like they've stripped away these certain things. So for example, I always remember when an American scientist goes abroad to speak at a convention, they're apparently obligated to tell, if they work with the government, they have to tell a story that the government approves. They can't be anti-government at an international convention because they work for the government. And it's things to do with that. It's like quite a big book. I thought you guys might be interested if you're all kind of doing scientific things in your lives. And then I was going to mention about there's this whole science about if you prove to someone that the climate crisis is coming up in their local hometown, they 100 times more likely to do something and care about it. And there's loads of stuff on it. And if you want papers, then look up Saffron O'Neill. And who's the other guy? Oh, Neil Adger. And if you're doing geography, then in second year there's a course. It's the Climate Change Science and Society course, and they talk about it then. So that's all that. But then Stuart Barr will probably go into it on Thursday. And then yeah, that's me. Those were the things I remembered. Does anyone have any last comments?
Just like piggybacking off of what you just said about
Yeah.
like people care more when it's local. If another person tells me that it's not a heat wave this week or that it's so unusual, I'm actually gonna cry. This is the 4th heat wave this summer. This is just summer now.
Yeah.
So yeah.
No, I agree. When one worry I have sometimes about the local issue is that I'm like, oh well, if everyone's only caring about the local issue, then like how are we going to start caring about like sub-Saharan Africa and everything that's going on now? Sometimes I worry about that as well. Like, but I know like it's a good like Kickstarter. Like, oh shit, like they did it. Saffron O'Neill did it with taking photos of their Australian town, and it was where they were going to flood and stuff, and like what shop would they lose and blah blah blah. So it was cool. But yeah, I probably won't be here on Thursday because that's when I'm graduating, and I'm pretty sure I'll be. Oh, do you hear? That's the sound it keeps making. Yeah, I probably won't be here, but then next week is when I'm doing my wellbeing one, so I'll be back. I hope you all enjoyed it. Yeah. If you have any questions or anything you want to talk about personally, you can just stay behind. But yeah, you're free to go. See you Thursday. Well, you'll see each other Thursday probably. But yeah, thanks for coming as well. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, it was a great session. Thank you, Beth.
No problem.
And great to see you all again.
Yeah. See you soon.
Thank you.
All right,
Bye.
cheers, guys.